The hook. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the October morning air at Morrison's auto repair, but Frank barely heard it anymore. At 64, his hands moved through the motions of rebuilding a transmission with the same precision that once made him Hollywood's most trusted stunt double. The difference was that engines didn't care about your past. They didn't whisper behind your back or cross the street when they saw you coming. Frank wiped grease from his fingers on a rag that had seen better decades, just like everything else in the shop. The 1967 Mustang on the lift above him was a fastback, Highland green, same color as the one from Bullitt. The irony wasn't lost on him. In Bakersfield, California, 43 years after that night in San Francisco, he was still working on Steve McQueen's cars, just not the way either of them had ever imagined. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Frank didn't look up. "Be with you in a minute," he called out, focusing on the transmission housing. Most customers were locals bringing in their pickup trucks or teenagers with more dreams than money trying to keep their first cars running. Frank Morrison? The voice was different, younger, not local. Frank's hands stilled on the wrench. In 4 decades of hiding in plain sight, very few people came looking for Frank Morrison specifically. The ones who did usually meant trouble. He slid out from under the Mustang and found himself looking at a woman in her 30s, holding a leather messenger bag and wearing the kind of clothes that cost more than most of his customers made in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes held the intensity of someone who'd spent years chasing stories. "Depends who's asking," Frank said, not moving closer. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles." She reached into her bag, and Frank's hand instinctively moved toward the tire iron on his workbench. "Old habits. I've been researching the incident on the set of the Bullitt sequel, October 14th, 1971. The words hit Frank like a punch to the chest. Nobody talked about that night. The studio had made sure of that. 43 years of silence, broken by a woman who wasn't even born when it happened. "Don't know what you're talking about," Frank said, but his voice betrayed him. The lie came out rough, unconvincing. Sarah pulled a manila envelope from her bag. "Mr. Morrison, 3 weeks ago, we found something in a storage unit that belonged to a deceased camera operator named Eddie Torino. He worked on the film that night." Frank's world tilted. Eddie Torino, the kid who'd been running the backup camera, positioned at the worst possible angle to catch what really happened. The studio had claimed all footage was destroyed or lost. Frank had spent 4 decades believing them. "Whatever you think you found, it's film stock, Mr. Morrison. 16mm footage that was never supposed to survive." Sarah's voice was steady, professional, but Frank could see the excitement underneath. "It shows everything. Jimmy Caldwell walking onto the set, the gun, your reaction, and something else the studio never wanted anyone to see." Frank's hands were shaking now. He shoved them into his coveralls pockets. "You need to leave. The gun was real, wasn't it?" The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Frank had never said those words out loud, not even to himself. The studio's version became the official story, a tragic accident with a prop gun, a momentary lapse in safety protocols, an unfortunate incident that required swift and decisive action to prevent a lawsuit. "I said you need to leave." Frank's voice was harder now, carrying the edge that had once made him fearless 30 feet in the air, doubling for the king of cool. Sarah pulled a photograph from the envelope and placed it on his workbench. It was grainy, blown up from film stock, but unmistakable. Jimmy Caldwell's face in the seconds before he raised the gun. His eyes weren't wild or desperate like a man having a breakdown. They were focused, determined, cold. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think what happened that night was an accident. I think someone wanted Steve McQueen dead, and you saved his life. I think that's why your career ended. I think that's why you've been hiding in this shop for 40 years. Frank stared at the photograph, and for a moment he was back on that set. The smell of cigarettes and coffee, the bright lights, McQueen's laugh carrying across the soundstage, Jimmy Caldwell walking toward them with something that looked wrong in his hand, all wrong, and Frank's instincts screaming at him to move, to act, to save his friend. "What do you want?" Frank asked quietly. "The truth," Sarah said. And I think you're the only person left alive who knows what really happened that night. Outside, a car engine backfired, and Frank flinched. After all these years, loud sounds still took him back to that moment when everything changed, when saving Steve McQueen's life cost him everything else. Frank turned away from the photograph, but the image burned behind his eyelids. Jimmy Caldwell's face, frozen in that moment of terrible purpose. He'd carried that expression in his memory for 43 years, telling himself he'd imagined the coldness, the calculation. Props departments made mistakes, actors had breakdowns. The official story was easier to live with than the alternative. "You don't understand what you're messing with," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The shop suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. Some doors should stay closed. Sarah stepped closer, her reflection catching in the chrome of a hubcap hanging on the wall. "People are already dead, Mr. Morrison. Eddie Torino didn't die of natural causes. The storage unit where we found the footage, it was supposed to be cleaned out 30 years ago, but a clerical error kept it active. Someone's been paying for it all this time, keeping it locked away." Frank's chest tightened. Eddie had been just a kid, maybe 22, with dreams of becoming a cinematographer. After that night, Frank never saw him again. Like so many others who'd been on set, Eddie had simply disappeared from the industry. Frank had assumed they'd all moved on, found other work, other lives. The bell above the door chimed again, and both Frank and Sarah turned. A familiar figure stepped inside, Miguel Santos, Frank's only employee and the closest thing to family he had left. Miguel was 35, built like a linebacker but gentle with engines the way some people were gentle with children. He'd been working at the shop for 8 years, ever since Frank had found him sleeping in the back of a broken-down Camaro in the parking lot. "Frank, you okay?" Miguel's dark eyes moved between Frank and Sarah, reading the tension in the air. Heard voices. Thought maybe there was trouble. Frank almost smiled despite everything. Miguel had an instinct for trouble, probably developed during his years on the streets of East LA before he drifted north looking for work. The kid, Frank still thought of him as a kid, though Miguel had a daughter of his own now, had never asked about Frank's past. He'd accepted the job, the small apartment above the shop, and Frank's occasional nightmares without question. "No trouble," Frank said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Miss Chen was just leaving." Sarah glanced at Miguel, then back at Frank. "I'm staying at the Hampton Inn on Rosedale Highway, room 237. She placed a business card on the workbench next to the photograph. The footage shows someone else on set that night. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone in a suit talking to Caldwell just minutes before it happened. Frank's blood went cold. He remembered the suits, studio executives who usually stayed far from actual filming, claiming the sets were too chaotic, too unpredictable. But that night there had been more of them than usual. Watching, waiting. "Think about it," Sarah continued. "Steve McQueen was becoming a problem for some very powerful people. He was asking for more control over his films, more money, talking about starting his own production company. He had dirt on studio heads, knew about their business practices. Men have been killed for less." Miguel moved closer, and Frank caught the scent of coffee on his clothes. Miguel always stopped at the donut shop on 2nd Street before work, bringing Frank a black coffee and a maple bar, whether Frank wanted them or not. It was a small kindness, a routine that had anchored Frank's mornings for years. "Frank," Miguel said quietly, "maybe you should sit down. You look pale." Frank realized his hands were gripping the edge of the workbench so hard his knuckles had gone white. Through the shop's front window he could see the normal world continuing. Cars passing on the street, a mother pushing a stroller, old Mr. Henley walking his arthritic basset hound. All of it felt suddenly fragile, temporary. Sarah gathered the photograph and tucked it back into her envelope. "I know this is a lot to process, but Mr. Morrison, if I'm right about this, then what you did that night, stopping Jimmy Caldwell, you didn't just save Steve McQueen, you disrupted something much bigger. And I think you've been paying for it ever since." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Eddie Torino's daughter hired me to make this documentary. She was 4 when her father died. She deserves to know why." After she left, the shop fell silent except for the distant hum of the air compressor and the tick of the old Coca-Cola clock on the wall. Miguel stood near the door, watching Frank with the careful attention of someone who'd seen people break before. "You want to talk about it?" Miguel asked. Frank looked at the business card Sarah had left behind. In 43 years, no one had come this close to the truth. Part of him felt relief. The burden of carrying the secret alone had worn him down like rust eating through metal. But another part, the part that had kept him alive all these years, whispered warnings. Some truths were more dangerous than lies. Frank stared at Sarah's business card for a long moment, the black letters swimming before his eyes. The silence stretched between him and Miguel like a taut wire, ready to snap. Outside, the familiar sounds of Bakersfield continued. Traffic, distant machinery, the everyday rhythm of a city that had never known Steve McQueen or Jimmy Caldwell, or the night that changed everything. "Frank?" Miguel's voice was gentle but persistent. "What's going on, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before Frank could answer, the phone behind the cash register began to ring. The old rotary phone, a relic Frank had refused to replace, despite Miguel's complaints that it made the shop look stuck in the past. Frank let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Nobody called the shop this early except for emergencies or wrong numbers. On the 4th ring, he picked up. Morrison's Auto. Silence. Then a voice that made Frank's blood turn to ice water. "Hello, Frank." The voice was older now, roughened by decades of cigarettes and whiskey, but Frank recognized it immediately. "Ray Kellerman, studio fixer. The man who cleaned up Hollywood's messes and buried its secrets so deep they'd never see daylight again." Frank's hand tightened on the receiver. "Ray, it's been a long time, hasn't it? 43 years since we last spoke. I hear you've built yourself a nice little life up there in Bakersfield. Quiet, peaceful, the kind of life a man could grow old in if he's smart enough to leave well enough alone." Miguel moved closer, concern creasing his features. Frank turned away, facing the wall where a calendar from 1997 still hung. Another relic he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "What do you want, Ray?" "I want what I've always wanted, Frank. For everyone to mind their own business. But it seems someone's been digging where they shouldn't dig. A documentary filmmaker. Pretty little Asian girl with more curiosity than sense." Frank's chest tightened. Sarah had left the shop less than 10 minutes ago. How did Ray already know? "I don't know what you're talking about." Ray's laugh was like sandpaper against glass. "Come on, Frank. We both know you're smarter than that. You always were the sharpest one on McQueen's crew. It's why you lasted as long as you did, and why you're still breathing when so many others aren't." "Eddie Torino," Frank said quietly. "Poor Eddie. Died in his sleep, they said. Heart attack at 38. Tragic, really. Young man like that, his whole life ahead of him. But then again, Eddie had developed some troubling habits in his later years. Drinking too much, asking too many questions, writing letters to reporters about things that were none of his business." Frank closed his eyes, seeing Eddie's face on that final night. Young, eager, proud to be working on a Steve McQueen picture. The kid had been running the backup camera, positioned where he could catch everything. Frank had forgotten about him in the chaos that followed, forgotten that someone else might have seen what really happened. "The footage," Frank said, "is going to disappear, just like it should have years ago. Along with anyone foolish enough to think they can profit from it. Miss Chen is going to discover that documentary filmmaking can be a very dangerous profession. Accidents happen, equipment failures, sometimes people just vanish. Leave her out of this." "That's not up to me anymore, Frank. This has gone too far up the food chain. There are people involved now who make the old studio bosses look like choir boys, people who've built empires on the foundations we laid back then. They don't like loose ends." Frank opened his eyes and found Miguel watching him intently. The younger man's face had gone pale, and Frank realized his own voice had been rising, carrying more of the conversation than he'd intended. "What do you want from me?" Frank asked. "The same thing I wanted 43 years ago. Your silence. Miss Chen is going to come to you again, probably tonight, maybe tomorrow. When she does, you're going to tell her you lied, that you don't remember anything useful, that the official story was true, and she's wasting her time chasing ghosts. And if I don't, then you'll join Eddie and the others. But not before you watch that Mexican boy of yours go first. And after that, we'll pay a visit to your daughter in Sacramento." Catherine, isn't it? Works at the state capitol, has 2 beautiful children, your grandchildren that you've never met because you were too proud and too stubborn to make things right. The words hit Frank like physical blows. Ray knew everything, about Miguel, about Catherine, about the grandchildren whose names Frank didn't even know. 43 years of careful isolation, and it had all been an illusion. They'd been watching, waiting. You son of a bitch. 24 hours, Frank. Convince the girl to walk away, or everyone you care about pays the price. And Frank? Don't even think about running. We found you once. We can find you again. The line went dead, leaving Frank holding a silent receiver and staring at the reflection of a frightened old man in the phone's chrome surface. Frank stood frozen with the dead receiver in his hand, the dial tone drilling into his ear like a warning siren. His reflection in the phone's chrome surface showed a man who'd aged a decade in the span of a single conversation. Behind him, Miguel's work boots scraped against the concrete floor. Frank? Who was that? Frank hung up the phone with deliberate care, buying himself time to think. His hands were steady now, the same steadiness that had once saved Steve McQueen's life. But his mind was racing through possibilities, all of them bad. Ray Kellerman wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. If he said Miguel was in danger, if he knew about Catherine and her children, nobody important, Frank said, the lie tasting like motor oil in his mouth. Wrong number. Miguel's dark eyes studied Frank's face with the intensity of a mechanic diagnosing an engine problem. Man, I've been working for you for 8 years. I know the difference between a wrong number and whatever the hell that was. Frank moved to the workbench and picked up Sarah's business card, turning it over in his fingers. The smart thing would be to burn it, forget she'd ever existed, go back to the quiet routine that had kept him alive for 4 decades. But Eddie Torino's face kept floating through his memory. Young, eager Eddie, who died of a convenient heart attack at 38. The bell above the door chimed again, and both men turned. Frank's muscles tensed, expecting Ray Kellerman himself or one of his people. Instead, Mrs. Patterson shuffled in with her cane, wearing the same flower print dress she'd worn to the shop every Tuesday for the past 6 years. "Morning, Frank," she said in her wavering voice. "That rattle in my Buick is getting worse. Sounds like a snake in a tin can." "Morning, Mrs. P," Frank managed, his voice almost normal. "Miguel will take a look at it for you." Miguel shot him a questioning glance but moved toward the elderly woman. "Let me get the keys, Mrs. Patterson. We'll have you sorted out in no time." As Miguel helped Mrs. Patterson with the paperwork, Frank found himself studying the ordinary scene, the old woman counting out crumpled bills from her purse, Miguel's patient explanation of what they'd need to do, the morning sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. This was his world now, small, safe, predictable. But Ray's words echoed in his head. "We found you once. We can find you again." Had it all been an illusion? The anonymity, the distance from Hollywood, the careful construction of Frank Morrison the mechanic instead of Frank Morrison the stunt double? For 43 years he'd believed in his invisibility. Now he wondered if they'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remind him who really held the leash. After Mrs. Patterson left, Miguel locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. Frank didn't protest. They both knew this conversation couldn't wait for normal business hours. "Okay," Miguel said, leaning against the counter. "Start from the beginning. That woman who was here, she wasn't asking about carburetors, was she?" Frank sank onto the stool behind the register, suddenly feeling every one of his 64 years. "She's a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles. About what? About something that happened a long time ago. Something I was hoping would stay buried." Miguel waited, and Frank found himself grateful for the younger man's patience. In 8 years, Miguel had never pushed for details about Frank's past, accepting the fragments Frank occasionally shared without demanding the full story. But now the full story was clawing its way to the surface, whether Frank wanted it there or not. "There was an incident," Frank said slowly. "On a movie set. Someone got hurt. I was involved." "You hurt someone?" "No, the opposite. I stopped someone from getting hurt. Someone important. But there were complications. People who didn't want the truth to come out." Miguel's expression darkened. "And now this filmmaker is stirring things up." Frank nodded. "She has footage, evidence that could change everything." Prove what really happened that night. So what's the problem? If you're innocent and safe are two different things. Frank pulled out Sarah's business card again. The people involved, they're not going to just let this happen. They've already killed to keep this quiet. They'll kill again. The words hung in the air between them. Miguel moved to the front window and peered through the blinds at the parking lot, his body language shifting into something more alert, more dangerous. Frank recognized the change. He'd seen it before when trouble found Miguel on the streets. They threatened you, Miguel said. It wasn't a question. Frank thought about lying again, but what was the point? Ray knew everything anyway. They threatened you. And my daughter in Sacramento, her kids. Miguel turned from the window, his face hard. Then we call the police. Frank almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. These people own police departments, Miguel. They own judges, politicians, entire networks of power that go back decades. The police can't protect us from this. Miguel's jaw tightened, and Frank saw something flicker in his eyes, a darkness that reminded Frank why the younger man had ended up sleeping in a broken-down Camaro 8 years ago. There were parts of Miguel's past they'd never discussed, just as there were parts of Frank's that had remained buried until today. So, what's the play? Miguel asked, his voice carrying a new edge. We just sit here and let them call the shots? Frank stared at the business card until the letters blurred together. 24 hours. Ray's deadline echoed in his skull like a countdown timer. I don't know what happened that night. On the movie set? The question Frank had been dreading for 43 years, asked by the only person left who might understand. Frank closed his eyes and let himself remember, really remember, not the sanitized version he'd filed away in the deepest corners of his mind. There was this actor, Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy Caldwell. Young guy, maybe 25. He'd been having trouble on set, drinking, showing up late, causing scenes. Word was he owed money to the wrong people, gambling debts. Miguel pulled up another stool, settling in to listen. We were filming a night scene in Chinatown. Steve was supposed to walk out of this restaurant, get in his car, drive away, simple stuff. But Jimmy was lurking around set all day, agitated, talking to people he shouldn't be talking to. I should have paid more attention, but Frank shrugged. Wasn't my job to babysit troubled actors. The memory sharpened, bringing with it the scent of fog rolling in from the bay and the harsh glare of movie lights cutting through San Francisco's darkness. When Steve came out of the restaurant, Jimmy was waiting, pulled what looked like a prop gun from his jacket and aimed it right at Steve's head. Everyone thought it was some kind of breakdown, actors losing their grip on reality. But something about the way Jimmy was holding it. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he remembered the weight of decision compressed into a split second. I tackled Jimmy before he could pull the trigger. We went down hard, and the gun went off. The bullet went wide, shattered a storefront window half a block away. Jesus, Miguel breathed. That's when I knew it was real. Real gun, real bullets, real attempt on Steve's life. But before I could say anything, before anyone could process what had actually happened, these studio executives swarmed us. Ray Kellerman and his people. They had Jimmy sedated and in an ambulance within minutes. Official story was that it was a prop gun malfunction, a tragic accident that could have been worse. Frank opened his eyes and found Miguel staring at him with a mixture of awe and horror. You saved Steve McQueen's life. Yeah. And it ruined mine. The bitterness in Frank's voice surprised even him. See, Jimmy didn't come up with the assassination plan on his own. Someone paid him. Someone with enough juice to make sure the real story never came out, to make sure everyone who knew the truth either stayed quiet or disappeared. Including you. Including me. Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Mrs. Patterson's Buick sat waiting for repair. Such a simple problem. A loose heat shield or worn suspension component. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with the right tools and a little time. They offered me a choice. Take the money and keep my mouth shut, or have an unfortunate accident like Jimmy did. What happened to Jimmy? Found dead in his cell 3 days later. Apparent suicide. Hung himself with his bed sheets. Frank's reflection looked back at him from the window glass, older, grayer, carrying the weight of decades of silence. Except Jimmy was left-handed, and the knot was tied for a right-handed person. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. When Frank turned back, he found the younger man studying Sarah's business card with intense concentration. "This filmmaker," Miguel said finally. "She knows all this? She knows enough. And she has footage that proves the gun was real. Which means she can prove everything else, the cover-up, the murder, all of it. So why haven't you talked before now? Why keep it secret all these years?" Frank thought about Catherine, about the daughter who'd stopped taking his calls 15 years ago when he'd missed her college graduation because Ray Kellerman had made it clear that showing up would be a mistake. He thought about the grandchildren he'd never met, the family dinners he'd never attended, the life he'd surrendered to keep them all safe. "Because the alternative was watching everyone I loved die," Frank said. "And maybe that was the right choice. Maybe it still is." Miguel stood and moved to the workbench, picking up a wrench and testing its weight in his hand. Or maybe it's time to stop letting them call the shots. The suggestion hung between them like a challenge, dangerous and tempting. Frank felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in 43 years, the possibility of fighting back. Frank was about to respond when his cell phone buzzed against the workbench. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the timing made his stomach clench. He answered on the second ring. "Frank Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, young, nervous, definitely not Ray Kellerman. "Who's asking?" "My name is David Chen. I'm calling about my sister, Sarah. She came to see you this morning about a documentary project." Frank's blood turned cold. "What about her?" "She's missing, Mr. Morrison. Her car was found abandoned on Highway 99 about an hour ago. No sign of struggle, no accident, just empty. Her phone, her purse, everything was still inside except for her." The phone felt suddenly heavy in Frank's hand. Across the shop, Miguel had gone very still, reading the terror in Frank's expression. "The police think she just wandered off, maybe got disoriented. But that's not Sarah. She doesn't just disappear. The last text she sent was from your address. She said she'd found something important, something that would change everything about her film." Frank closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's earnest face, remembering how her hands had shaken slightly when she'd shown him the footage. 24 hours, Ray had said. They hadn't even waited 24 minutes. "Mr. Morrison, are you there?" "I'm here. I know this is a lot to ask, but I'm driving up from LA right now. Could you meet with me, please? I think Sarah found something at your shop, something that might help us understand what happened to her." Frank was quiet for so long that David Chen began to repeat his question. Finally, Frank cut him off. "Don't come here," Frank said, his voice hoarse. "It's not safe." "What do you mean it's not?" Frank ended the call and stood staring at the silent phone. In the space of one morning, everything he'd built had crumbled. Sarah Chen was gone, almost certainly dead. Her brother was driving blindly into the same trap, and Frank was right back where he'd been 43 years ago, watching innocent people die because of what he knew. "They took her," Miguel said quietly. Frank nodded, unable to speak. "The filmmaker. They took her because she talked to you." "I should have warned her," Frank whispered. "I should have told her to run the second she walked through that door." Miguel moved closer, his voice gaining intensity. "Frank, listen to me. This isn't your fault, isn't it?" Frank turned to face him, and Miguel stepped back at the raw anguish in the older man's eyes. "Everyone who gets close to this story dies, Miguel. Everyone. And I just keep surviving while they drop bodies around me." Frank's mind was racing now, connecting dots he'd refused to see before. Eddie Torino, the kid with the backup camera. Ray said he died of a heart attack, but what if that footage Sarah has? What if it came from Eddie? What if he hid copies before they killed him? Miguel was nodding slowly. That would mean Eddie tried to expose this conspiracy 20 years ago, and they murdered him for it. Just like they murdered Jimmy Caldwell. Just like they've murdered God knows how many others. Frank's voice was building towards something that might have been rage or might have been grief. "And now Sarah Chen is dead because I was too much of a coward to warn her." "You don't know she's dead." Frank laughed bitterly. "Her car abandoned on a highway? No sign of struggle? That's exactly how they do it, Miguel. Clean, professional, deniable. She's probably already in a shallow grave somewhere in the desert." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Frank realized he'd crossed some invisible line. For 43 years, he'd told himself that his silence was protecting people, that by keeping the secret, he was keeping Catherine safe, keeping himself alive, maintaining some kind of balance. But balance required that both sides have something to lose. Ray Kellerman and his people had just demonstrated that they could reach out and erase someone in broad daylight, while Frank hid in his garage changing oil filters and pretending the past didn't exist. "There's something else," Frank said slowly, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. "Something I never told you about that night." Miguel waited. Steve McQueen knew. The words felt like a confession pulled from Frank's deepest places. "After I tackled Jimmy, after the gun went off and the executives swarmed in, Steve pulled me aside. He looked me right in the eye and said, 'Thank you, Frank. I owe you everything.' But then, when Ray made his offer," Frank's voice cracked. "When they made it clear I had to disappear or die, Steve just stood there. Didn't say a word. Let them destroy my career, let them exile me, let them erase me like I'd never existed." Miguel's face had gone very still. "He abandoned you." "The king of cool," Frank said with devastating quiet. "My best friend for 15 years, and when it mattered most, he chose his career over my life." The silence stretched between them like a wound, and Frank could see Miguel processing the full scope of the betrayal. Not just the conspiracy, not just the murder and cover-up, but the personal devastation that cut deeper than any professional exile. Steve McQueen, the man Frank had taken bullets for, literally thrown himself in front of cars for, shared countless stunts and stories and late-night drinks with, had watched Frank's destruction and chosen silence. "That's why you never tried to come forward," Miguel said, understanding dawning in his voice. "It wasn't just fear of them. It was knowing that even the guy you saved wouldn't back you up." Frank nodded, feeling hollowed out by the admission. "I kept thinking maybe he'd call. Maybe he'd find a way to help without putting himself at risk." But months went by, then years, and nothing. Radio silence. Like I'd never existed. Miguel stood and began pacing the small office space, his hands clenched into fists. "So they not only destroyed your career, they made sure you had nowhere to run, no allies, no one who'd believe your story." "Ray Kellerman is a genius at psychological warfare," Frank said, sinking back onto his stool. "He didn't just threaten me, he isolated me completely, made me complicit in my own erasure." The phone buzzed again. This time Frank recognized the number, and his blood pressure spiked immediately. "Morrison." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Frank, I'm disappointed." Ray Kellerman's voice carried that same paternal tone that had haunted Frank's nightmares. "We had an understanding about visitors, about stirring up ancient history. She came to me. I didn't ask for this." "No, but you didn't send her away either. And now we have complications." A pause. "Her brother is quite insistent about finding her. Very vocal with the local police. It's creating unnecessary attention." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "Where is she?" Ray chuckled softly. "Safe, for now. Though I must say, her research was impressively thorough. That Torino boy was cleverer than we gave him credit for. Multiple copies, hidden locations. Quite the insurance policy." Miguel had stopped pacing and was watching Frank's side of the conversation with predatory intensity. Frank met his eyes and saw his own rage reflected back. "What do you want, Ray?" "The same thing I've always wanted, Frank. Quiet, stability, the natural order maintained. Miss Chen has footage and documents that could be misinterpreted. We need to ensure that material doesn't find its way into the wrong hands. And if I help you clean up your mess, then Miss Chen takes a nice long vacation somewhere with poor cell phone reception. Eventually she decides documentary filmmaking isn't for her, finds a new passion, lives a long, quiet life." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Frank almost believed it himself. Almost. "And if I don't?" "Well," Ray's voice hardened almost imperceptibly, "then we're back to our original conversation about your daughter's lovely family in Sacramento. Catherine's been doing so well at her teaching job. Be a shame if budget cuts force some difficult staffing decisions." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Ray's chess game settling around him. Every move calculated, every pressure point mapped and catalogued. 43 years, and nothing had changed. But when Frank opened his eyes, he found Miguel standing directly in front of him, holding out his hand. "Give me the phone," Miguel said quietly. Frank shook his head. "Miguel, don't—" "Give me the phone, Frank." Something in Miguel's voice made Frank comply. He watched in growing horror as Miguel brought the phone to his ear. "Mr. Kellerman? This is Miguel Santos. I work for Mr. Morrison, and I think you and I need to have a conversation about how business gets conducted around here." Frank lunged for the phone, but Miguel stepped back, his expression deadly calm. "See, the thing is," Miguel continued, "you're operating under some outdated assumptions, like thinking Frank is still the same scared man you pushed around 40 years ago. Like thinking he's still alone." Ray's voice was audible through the phone, sharp and dangerous, but Miguel didn't flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," Miguel said. "You're going to release Sarah Chen unharmed within the next 6 hours. You're going to leave Frank alone. You're going to leave his family alone. And you're going to disappear, back into whatever hole you crawled out of." Frank could hear Ray laughing, the sound like breaking glass. "And if I don't?" Ray's voice was loud enough for Frank to catch. Miguel's smile was winter cold. "Then I'm going to do what Frank should have done 43 years ago. I'm going to hunt you down and kill you myself." He ended the call and handed the phone back to Frank, who stared at him in stunned silence. "Miguel, you have no idea what you've done. These people don't make empty threats. Neither do I," Miguel said simply. "It's time to stop running, Frank. It's time to fight back." Frank stared at Miguel, seeing something in the younger man's eyes that he recognized from his own reflection 43 years ago. The moment when running stops being an option. But where Frank had chosen silence and exile, Miguel had chosen war. "You don't understand what you've just declared," Frank said, his voice barely steady. "Ray Kellerman isn't some street thug. He's connected to people who make problems disappear permanently." Miguel moved to the workbench and began methodically checking the tools laid out there. Wrenches, screwdrivers, a tire iron, maybe. "But here's what I understand that you don't. I'm not the same kind of problem he's used to dealing with." "What's that supposed to mean?" Miguel turned back to Frank, and for the first time since Frank had known him, he saw something dangerous in his employee's face. "It means I've been asking the wrong questions about my past, wondering why a guy with my skill set ended up working in a garage in Bakersfield instead of somewhere that pays better." Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him. "Miguel, you remember when I started here? How I never talked about my background? How I seemed to know a little too much about staying invisible?" Miguel's smile was sharp as broken glass. "That's because I spent 12 years working for people who make Ray Kellerman look like a Sunday school teacher." The admission hit Frank like a physical blow. He looked at Miguel, really looked, and saw the careful way he moved, the way his eyes constantly cataloged exit routes and potential weapons. Details that Frank had attributed to street smarts suddenly took on a much darker significance. "What people?" Frank whispered. "The kind who don't leave their real names on employment records. The kind who taught me that there are worse things than death, and sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to become the thing that scares the monsters." Miguel walked to the small window overlooking the parking lot, his posture relaxed but alert. "I came here because I was tired, Frank. Tired of the life, tired of the choices, tired of being afraid of my own shadow. Thought maybe fixing cars and changing oil would be enough. Thought maybe I could just disappear." Frank's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the Miguel he thought he knew with this stranger who had just threatened a Hollywood power broker with casual precision. "But here's the thing about guys like Kellerman," Miguel continued, still watching the window. "They only understand one language. They think everyone operates by their rules: fear, intimidation, leverage. They're not prepared for someone who's willing to burn it all down. Miguel, listen to me." "No, Frank, you listen." Miguel turned back to him, and Frank saw 43 years of his own cowardice reflected in the younger man's disappointed gaze. "You saved Steve McQueen's life. You're a hero. And instead of celebrating that, instead of fighting for justice, you let them turn you into a victim. You let them steal your courage. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Frank felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but opening. Like a valve that had been sealed shut for decades, suddenly releasing pressure. "Sarah Chen is going to die because of my cowardice," Frank said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe she's going to live because you finally decide to do something about it." Frank walked to his desk and pulled out the bottom drawer, reaching behind a stack of old invoices to retrieve a manila envelope he hadn't touched in 20 years. His hands shook as he opened it and pulled out a photograph, a candid shot from the set that night, showing Jimmy Caldwell in the background, talking intensely to a man in an expensive suit. "Ray Kellerman," Frank said, holding up the photo, talking to Jimmy 30 minutes before the assassination attempt. "I kept this as insurance, but I never had the guts to use it." Miguel studied the photograph, his expression thoughtful. "This proves conspiracy. Combined with Sarah's footage, it proves everything. Murder, cover-up, the whole thing." Frank looked at his hands, still trembling slightly. "But I can't do this alone. If we move against Ray, if we try to expose this, they'll come at us with everything they have." "Good," Miguel said simply. "I'm tired of being afraid." Frank met his eyes and saw his own reflection there. Not the broken-down mechanic he'd become, but the stuntman who had once thrown himself between bullets and the people he cared about. The man who had saved Steve McQueen's life without hesitation. "All right," Frank said, his voice growing stronger. "But we do this smart. We get Sarah back first. Then we burn their whole world down." Miguel nodded, already moving toward the door. "Now you're talking like the man who took on a gunman to save the king of cool." As they prepared to leave the garage, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in 43 years, the fierce joy of fighting back. The warehouse sat like a concrete tomb in the industrial district, its windows dark, except for a single light bleeding through a crack in the boarded entrance. Frank parked the Mustang 3 blocks away, the engine's rumble echoing off empty buildings before settling into silence. "You sure about this?" Miguel asked, checking the Glock he'd produced from somewhere Frank hadn't wanted to ask about. Frank touched the photograph in his jacket pocket, his insurance policy, his proof, his 43-year burden finally about to find its purpose. "I should have done this decades ago." They moved through the shadows like ghosts, Frank's old stunt training surfacing muscle memory he'd thought was lost forever. Behind him, Miguel moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, many times before. The realization should have disturbed Frank more than it did. The warehouse door stood slightly ajar. Too easy. Frank hesitated, recognizing the setup, but Miguel was already moving past him with professional confidence. Inside, they found Sarah Chen tied to a chair under a single hanging bulb, her face bruised but her eyes alert and furious. "Mr. Morrison," she said, relief flooding her voice. "The footage, did you find—" Touching reunion. Ray Kellerman stepped from the shadows, looking exactly as he had 20 years ago, silver-haired, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of power that came from never hearing the word no. 2 men flanked him, their suits bulging in telling places. Frank felt the familiar paralysis trying to claim him, the same fear that had kept him silent for 4 decades. But then Miguel stepped forward, and something shifted in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. "Mr. Kellerman," Miguel said pleasantly. "So good to finally meet in person." Ray's confident smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Santos, I've been making some inquiries about you since our phone conversation. Very interesting background. Very specialized skill set. I thought you might do that." Miguel's tone remained conversational, even as his hand drifted toward his jacket. "Find anything useful? Enough to know you're not as untouchable as you think. Everyone has pressure points, Mr. Santos. Everyone has something to lose." That's when Frank realized they'd walked into something bigger than a rescue. This wasn't about Sarah anymore. It was about 43 years of accumulated debt coming due all at once. Ray nodded to his men, who began moving to flank them. But Miguel was already in motion, the Glock appearing in his hand with liquid smoothness. The first shot echoed through the warehouse like thunder. What followed lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt like hours. Frank threw himself toward Sarah, while Miguel did what Miguel did best. something that involved precise violence and the kind of professional competence that left no room for heroic gestures or lucky breaks. When the shooting stopped, Ray Kellerman sat on the concrete floor, his expensive suit torn and bloody, staring at Miguel with something approaching respect. "The photograph," Frank said, pulling Sarah's restraints free. "Show him the photograph." Frank placed the 43-year-old image on the floor between them. Jimmy Caldwell and Ray Kellerman, conspirators caught in black and white. Combined with Sarah's footage, it was enough to unravel everything. "It's over," Frank said, and for the first time in decades he believed it. 3 months later, Frank stood in his empty garage, boxes stacked around him like tombstones. The documentary had aired the week before, Sarah's footage combined with Frank's testimony and Miguel's expertise in handling the cleanup. Ray Kellerman was dead, his network exposed, the conspiracy finally dragged into daylight. The phone rang, Catherine's voice, tentative but warm. "Dad? I saw the documentary. I understand now. Why you left, why you couldn't come back." Frank closed his eyes, feeling something he'd forgotten existed. Forgiveness, freely given by someone who mattered. "I'm selling the shop," he told her. "Miguel's got a new job lined up somewhere that doesn't ask too many questions. I was thinking maybe I could finally come home." "I'd like that," Catherine said, and Frank heard tears in her voice. "I'd like that very much." After they hung up, Frank walked through the garage one final time. 43 years of exile, of hiding, of believing that silence was safety. Sarah Chen's story had changed everything, not just for the public, but for him. He was no longer Frank Morrison, the broken stuntman. He was Frank Morrison who saved Steve McQueen's life and finally told the truth. Outside, Miguel waited by a black sedan, engine running. "Ready?" Miguel asked. Frank locked the garage door for the last time and climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove toward the highway, toward whatever came next, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since 1971, the fierce joy of being exactly who he was supposed to be. Behind them, Bakersfield disappeared into dust and memory. Ahead lay Sacramento, reconciliation, and the strange peace that comes from finally setting down a burden you were never meant to carry alone. The King of Cool would have understood that kind of courage, Frank thought. He would have approved.